Tanakoto, Kaya Wanju. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I was asked to speak at the Astronomers for Planet Earth Symposium on the work that I led a few years ago on the imperative to reduce carbon emissions in astronomy. And while it's been 3 years since I put that piece of work together, that imperative that existed then still exists today. So the study that I led was based in Australia, and it was about trying to take account of what the carbon footprint of astronomy as a field was. And just to give you a bit of context before I go into details, Australia is one of the highest emitting countries per capita in the world. It currently sits at something like 25 tons of carbon dioxide per non-dependent, where a non-dependent is somebody aged above 15. And I like to use that as my denominator because I do not think that we can ever blame children for contributions towards climate change. And as you can see from the plot that's here, this is a number that hasn't really changed too much over the course of the last 20 years. So as a community that lives in this high emitting country, it became especially relevant for us to consider what our contribution to the largest problem in the world, that is the climate crisis, is. And in 2019, there were a number of works coming out discussing this problem from communities in the United States and in Canada. And at this time, we were also conducting the midterm review for our decadal plan of astronomy in Australia. And for the first time, we put together a team, which I led, to consider the sustainability of astronomy in our field. So we conducted what was, I believe, the first study to account for the carbon footprint of astronomy. And we had 4 things that we wanted to take into account. And we picked these 4 things because we figured that they would be the largest contributors to our carbon footprint. Now, there may well be, and as in fact I'll get to later on in this talk, other sources of emissions in addition to these, but this is all we took into account. And so to really cut to the chase quite quickly, what we found, much to our surprise, is that at least within the Australian community, supercomputing accounts for the majority of our carbon footprint. We use something like 400 million CPU hours per year. And flights, which we thought going into this would be something that was the largest single contributor, is actually a second place, although it's quite possible that observatories carry a higher carbon footprint than what we were able to estimate, because we only got a subset of all of the observatories that Australian astronomers use, although it was close to a complete data set. And of course, the powering of offices comes out last, which was unsurprising. So why was supercomputing so high? Well, I mean, computers obviously use a large amount of energy, and if you're needing to use 400 million CPU hours per year, and you live in a country where the energy that powers those supercomputers comes predominantly from the burning of fossil fuels, then it just so happens that ends up carrying a very high carbon footprint. So one of the things that we identified in that study is that we really need to be putting pressure on supercomputing facilities that we regularly use to source their energy sustainably. And astronomy is only one player in this, obviously. There are many other fields of science, many areas of industry that rely on the access to supercomputers that may well have much larger requirements than astronomy does. And this is something that we can join forces with. So I'm pleased to be able to let you know that since that study was conducted in 2019, although published in 2020 in Nature Astronomy, the situation has improved somewhat, at least in Australia, where 2 of the sites of our main supercomputers, we have 3 main sites, one in Canberra, one in Melbourne, and one in Perth. The sites in Canberra and Melbourne are now fully powered by renewable energy. In the case of Canberra, this was done through the Australian Capital Territory government, such that they are now responsible for having built more renewable energy than the entire territory uses. So that does go into the national grid. And that does mean that if you were to pick up the National Computing Infrastructure Centre from Canberra and move it, say, to Sydney, the actual overall carbon footprint of Australia wouldn't change, right? Because it's all just power going into the grid. But nevertheless, the power requirements of that facility were obviously part of what the government were taking into account when they set out this goal, which they then achieved. And one of our other supercomputing facilities is at Swinburne University. That university has now procured a new wind farm. Again, this is power that is going into the grid. So it's not like these are islands, right, where these facilities exist. But this is actually the best way to do it, because it means that you're always using all of that renewable energy that's available. And the important thing here is that in each of these cases, they were new facilities that were established. So there was an increase in the amount of renewable energy being produced. And that's really the only way that we can go to get to a solution towards the climate crisis. Well, it's one of the many solutions that we need to have, I should say. It's not the only one. We hope that by the end of this decade that we'll be able to say the same thing for the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre in Western Australia. On average, actually, Western Australia has a lower rate of emissions per kilowatt hour of energy that you pull out of the grid than places like New South Wales or Victoria. And that's thanks to the increased amount of sunshine we have here and the abundance of solar panels that people have on their houses. But it's still a grid that's primarily reliant on the burning of coal, although the state government plans to phase all of those out by the end of this decade. And that we should be seeing an increase in renewable energy to replace that. Okay, so with the changes that we had to the energy landscape of Australia in the last couple of years, and with the COVID pandemic, the situation in 2020 looked a lot more optimistic than it did in 2019. So these are just rough estimates that I put together where I haven't changed the amount for observatories, because I'm assuming that stayed the same. But in that year, in the midst of the pandemic, there were no flights taking place whatsoever. So that component of our carbon footprint was removed. And, you know, I actually think this is a positive thing that came out of the pandemic, the fact that we no longer had to worry about this one significant component to our footprint. And I recall challenging my national community at our annual science meeting that now that we've had this problem taken care of outside of our control, the onus is now on us to make sure that we don't bring that problem back. Which I'll get back to in a second. But you'll notice that supercomputing bar for carbon footprint's also been cut down by more than half. Now, I haven't put error bars on here. These are very much just rough estimates. So don't take these numbers too seriously in terms of absolute values, but just know that the changes that have taken place have been of significance. And in 2022, well, from what I've seen, flights are back in action. Many people are traveling again for work. And it's not clear to me if that is at the same rate as it was before, or whether it's a slightly reduced rate. My suspicion is it probably is slightly reduced, but whether it gets back to where it was before, we'll have to figure that out and take account of that over the next year or two. But I'm concerned that it is going back in that direction, and that really flies in the face of all of the advice that many of us in the community, especially in Astronomers for Planet Earth, have been giving around how we need to change our habits. And we had the opportunity to get used to doing our jobs with less flying too. And so it really just seems like such a wasted opportunity to do something good in a situation that was ultimately not great, right? Nobody wanted to be in a pandemic and be forced into lockdowns and be forced to not be able to leave their own cities and see their loved ones and so forth, obviously. But it was an opportunity for us to learn how to live differently, more sustainably. It should be said that while this might have been one of the first studies conducted on astronomers' carbon footprint, it certainly isn't the only one. In the same issue of Nature Astronomy, a study came out led by Knud Janker that compared what we found in Australia to the carbon footprint of members of the Max Planck Institute for Astronomy, which you might assume is representative of Germany. And To no surprise, the overall footprint of doing astronomy in Germany is much lower than it is in Australia, and this, of course, just comes back to where the energy is supplied. Of course, that electricity bar there that accounts for supercomputing is now much lower in Australia. I should also say that the footprint associated with flights that we conducted in our study was just based on what the airlines told us the footprints of all of the flights that we had. So we had real data on astronomers' actual flights over the course of a year, and we took the airlines' values at face value, but that doesn't take into account the longer lasting effects of emitting that CO2 at altitude, where you can get the production of contrails, for example, which have an increased radiative forcing than what you would have if you just emitted those molecules at ground level instead. And so the general consensus is that it's roughly a factor of 2 in terms of the in terms of the global warming impact that you get from flights relative to most other sources of emissions. Anyway, that's why those numbers are bigger. You'll see that the per person value in Germany is lower, and this is just a reflection of the fact that when people travel from Australia, even if they're doing a domestic trip, they're on average having to travel a much larger distance because of the fact that the country is so much more isolated and so much more lower density. There have since been studies in the last sort of 18 months that have come out of the Netherlands and France. The finding in the Netherlands, which was a bit different to what we found in the case of Germany, in the case of France, and in the case of Australia, was that in their case, in the Netherlands, the footprint of the average astronomer was lower than the average person in their country, whereas in all the other cases we found the opposite. And there are a number of extra things that are taken into account in the French study here. I'm not going to go into details because you may get to hear more about some of these studies over the course of this symposium. But one thing I do want to point out is that emissions scale with seniority. And one of the fears I hear from people a lot is, well, you know, if one of the solutions that we need to discuss is reducing the amount of flying that we do, isn't that going to hurt the careers of early career researchers and PhD students? But it's actually not them in the first instance who need to change their behavior. And as people who are young and have had less time to get into bad habits, it's actually much easier for us to adapt anyway. But it's the senior staff who are traveling much more. And what we really need to do is have leadership from those in senior positions, making an example by reducing the amount of flying that they're doing. And, you know, if they get an opportunity to speak at a given conference, well, first of all, hopefully that conference has remote attendance. But if it is the sort of event that really requires an in-person presence, then pass that opportunity on to someone young who can actually get more benefit out of it. Right, and just to highlight the importance of running meetings as hybrid or online, not only do you get a lower carbon footprint per person, but you get both an increase in the total number of people that attend meetings and a decrease in the total amount of emissions. So what this means is that not only are the people who previously were traveling actually more happy to not travel and attend a meeting in a virtual capacity, but by having that option virtually for people to attend, you're being much more inclusive because there are so many people who might not have had the means to attend a physical meeting in the first place who now have that opportunity to attend. All they need is an internet connection. It's a much lower barrier than having the funds to travel internationally. And this is particularly important when you think about areas of the world which just don't have anywhere near as much money as, say, Europe or North America do. And it's also particularly important for people who have caring responsibilities, or just in general more responsibilities in life that prevent them from being able to travel. So it might not even be, you know, a resources problem. It might just be a sheer time thing. And this is particularly important for a number of minorities, or at least groups who are underrepresented on average, I should say. Minority is the wrong term, but underrepresented groups. There is literature on how this specifically improves their attendance. And so this is why the fact that we're doing this symposium fully virtually is wonderful. Right, one of the things that we didn't do in our study that many other studies didn't do is actually look at what the carbon cost of building the infrastructure that astronomers need is. And this is something that was published in a study by Jürgen Knödelseder earlier this year. Maybe we'll hear about it more at the symposium, but it's really interesting to note that if you take the sum of the carbon emissions associated with the construction and launch of ground and space-based telescopes and divide it by the number of astronomers, you get a number that is greater than the sum of all the other components that I have discussed and that were in my study, for example, combined. So that is really concerning. And the only solution for something like this is to slow the rate at which we're building new facilities. And that's something that I think we can do, because I'm not convinced that we are fully harnessing the data sets that we already have, or even the observatories that we already have. We don't always need to be building something new. I know that that's a flashy thing to do, and that it's a good way to try to source funding. But is it really necessary? And if it's contributing to the world's largest problem, then is it something we should really be doing? There's a lot of food for thought that I've just thrown at you there. And I look forward to being able to discuss some of this content a little bit more with you in the upcoming discussion session at this meeting. So thank you very much for your attention.